Here we are. For many of you who have come across this subject for the first time, you're seeing it according to the news agenda. And given my aged years, I remember the power of the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s in the US. So we're sort of nearly just half a century and more beyond when we thought issues of that nature were sorted. That once black men and women got the right to vote in America, that was the end of the story. And then, just as David said in his introduction, Charlottesville comes along a couple of months ago, and you watch the resurgence of the white supremacy movement in the US, and you kind of think, where have they been for the last 50 years? And the answer is waiting for this time. Because there's nothing quite like ignorance and intransigence, and also a leadership that gives succor to racist voices. And once this time comes, out come the prejudices all over again. But it's not just America where these tensions are vivid and real. We're going to have a conversation in a couple of minutes, of course, about the criminality of the police services of the US, the killing of young black men, the discrimination which is embedded and therefore not removed by law. But beyond that, those of us who live in Europe have witnessed the increasing prejudice towards people coming from Syria as refugees, coming across the Mediterranean from Africa because they're seeking a new life. And then we watched the German elections just a few weeks ago. And I know there's a German contingent here, and you'll feel this more strongly than most of us. But 13.9% of the German people who voted for a far-right party for the first time in 60 years. And what they were saying in that, by putting 1 in 5 of all MPs into the Bundestag, they're saying it's time to recapture the great Germany of old. In the same way that there's a mantra that says it's time to make America great again, or it's time for the UK to stand alone on its own. This retrenchment from inclusion is really the momentum of racial politics. And behind it lies a fear of the other and an awkwardness about difference. Now, most of you will know that actually the biggest group of people anywhere on the planet who are represented here in this room are neither black nor white. They're Chinese. And the largest language on the face of the planet is not English, although we're speaking it here, it is Mandarin. And it's only going to be a short space of time before all of us move from just being English speakers or Spanish speakers or French speakers or German speakers into being Mandarin and something else speakers. Our world is changing very rapidly because of globalization and also because the reality of what was once a dismissed culture to us in the West has become the culture we look to for progression and for change and innovation. So we have to become people who accept and include and not people who exclude and diminish. And the conversation we're going to have is to allow us to understand partly what has gone on and what's gone wrong, but how we think about where we and you as young leaders take on the challenge that maybe my generation has failed significantly to be bold enough to fight hard enough about. So I'm going to bring on my panel. This is the first of 3. And this panel is going to be led for us, and I'm going to join the conversation by Amna Modin. Amna is a brilliant young journalist from Quartz magazine. She's going to lead the conversation. DeRay McKesson, who comes on from the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, and Denise Young Smith from Apple. You've heard from her before. Come on, panel. Let's have the chat.
Segregated. Let's move it. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that brilliant introduction. I won't go on too long. I think we're really excited to hear what DeRay, Denise, and Michael have to say. But yes, my name is Amna Modin. I work for Quartz. The first question is to you, DeRay. In the US, many on the far right and the iterations in the US, it's the so-called alt-right, have tried to protest under the banner of freedom of speech. So what you see is people complaining that they're not allowed to be racist anymore and being quite upset about this. This tension is really beginning to bear out on social media, particularly Twitter and Facebook. And I wanted to know from your perspective, where do we draw the line between freedom of speech and hate speech?
Yes, it's a good question, and we are struggling with this in America. Most people saw Charlottesville and what happened there in the country. When I think about freedom of speech, I'm reminded that it doesn't mean that there's freedom of the lack of consequences, that just because you can say things doesn't mean that you aren't held accountable for them. And I think that that applies to technology too, that we've seen Facebook, we've seen Twitter kick people off the platform because people are using their freedom of speech to incite hate and to incite violence across the country, and that can't be okay. The other thing I'm mindful of is that we think about protests as free speech too. So when we stand in the street and we say that the police shouldn't kill each other, when we are shutting down speeches and rallies, like that is also free speech. And I've seen some proponents of free speech sort of only think about free speech when you were able to, like in Ferguson, they wanted to set up like a little corner of the street that we could be in. And we're like, that's not free speech. Like, you don't get to tell me where I have to stand if I'm gonna push back against the government. So I'm mindful of those things. And with the alt-right, we've seen white supremacists become more popular in public than ever before in our lifetime. So when we think about using our platforms, it's about pushing back and about naming that tension so that we can fight it.
And just to follow up from that, do you feel like tech, and particularly social media, is becoming the battleground for civil rights for our generation?
Yeah, I think that, we would not have been able to build a movement if it was not for Twitter. That I think about Twitter as the friend that's always awake, which is why I tweet so much, because there's always somebody there. And if we had not had social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, we wouldn't have been able to show people what was actually happening because the dominant media didn't believe us in those moments.
Denise, what do you say in response to that?
I think that the solution, if there is a solution, the response to speech that we hate is not suppression, it's more speech. And so I think that, in the United States, for us, the First Amendment has to be protected at all costs. And it's hard. As DeRay says, it's difficult when you're in any situation where you're hearing sentiment, expression that is opposed to the fundamental values of democracy. But if those ideas aren't teased out, they're still seething below the surface, and they're manifested in actions and behaviors. And so the desire, as painful as it might be, is to tease out and unveil and reveal all of the attitudes, all of the sentiments of the citizenry, so that we can get to a point where we can have dialogue and get to resolution.
Michael, I know we in Europe don't have this commitment to the First Amendment in the same way, and we do have hate speech laws, and I've seen some Americans saying that's something we should look towards, that we should be implementing these hate speech laws. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that law only ever goes so far. And you can prohibit things consistently by law. You can also allow things by law, but you can prohibit the things people want to say, but it doesn't change what they think or what they feel. And what is said in private is so much more important almost than what is said in public. We didn't need to have the long speeches of white supremacists in Charlottesville to understand the way they would have worked together to get to the point to which they all appeared on the same day to lead a protest. There were conversations that went on in private, behind the scenes, which any hate legislation would not have dealt with. So whereas I would argue as a lawmaker that it is right to have legislation to protect people's dignities and to protect their freedoms, the protection really that we need is the change of mindset. We witnessed on this stage that wonderful video yesterday, which was just amazing, of different people looking at each other for the first time, looking into each other's eyes, discovering that the humanity of one another is pretty similar to the way they are, and then getting over their prejudice because they see somebody who has the same emotions that they feel. Now, once you've had that experience with people who are clearly different by race or by language, by culture, or by whatever, then you destroy the inner conversation that says, I must hate. So you change the conversation. You don't need law for that. What you need instead is engagement of person to person. That needs empathy.
I would just add that what I think the internet is doing is radicalizing young people in private in a way that we've not seen before. So you see these Instagram accounts of white supremacists that 200,000, 300,000 people follow. And you think about when Dylan Roof shot the 9 people in the church in the South in in the country is like you saw all these young people like using the internet to be radicalized in a way that I do think we have a responsibility to do something about. And maybe it's not laws, maybe it is just the tech companies like stepping up a little bit different. But seeing the internet radicalize people is, I think, the new frontier of like how we need to push back against this. That yes, it is free speech to an extent, but we have a responsibility to make sure that free speech doesn't veer off into violence.
I mean, I like the point that Denise made very strongly there, which was that instead of curtailing speech, you need more of the alternative speech. We need more of the positive love commitment speech. We need more of the understanding speech. I need to understand the other person by engaging with them, and that can overwhelm the hate speech, which is so dominant and lurking in the troughs.
I also think, that it's so important to understand what's behind the speech. To understand that hate speech is so frequently predicated by fear. And fear can be most often predicated by fears of one's absolute survival. So I often will look around at any particular dialogue or discourse and try to understand what's driving it, what's behind it, what are people afraid of. Economics are behind so much of it. If you go back, and back, you'll see just a system of economic lack, or this idea that if I have, you can't have, and if you have, I lose. And instead of, if everybody is contributing, then the sum is greater than the whole, and everyone can benefit from that.
And the idea of more speech works best when power is equally distributed. Because when you think about in America, like we tried to have more speech by standing in the street, and then we just got arrested, right? Like people weren't actually responsive because we didn't have enough power to overpower the speech of the people who were trying to suppress our speech. So I like the idea of more speech. I like it more when we are actually building systems and structures that equalize the power of people to deliver any message.
And you raised a really good point about the online radicalization of the far right. Do you feel like there's been enough of an emphasis of young white men being radicalized online? Because there's a lot of laws that are trying to tackle some of the radicalization that you see in the Muslim community from ISIS, but I'm not sure if we're seeing it as well from the far right and white nationalists.
I think that there are a lot of white people who like don't accept that there are white people who are terrorists, right? So you think about even the Las Vegas shooting, is that the media in America is working overtime to make him seem just like a lone wolf who took some pills and had a bad day. And it's like, no, he planned this out really long. Like this was like a pretty planned out sort of terror attack that he did.
So, you need to say it. You need to say it.
Yeah, but the media. So I don't think that the public is taking seriously this idea that white people are being radicalized and doing really damaging things across the country. I think that it's easier when it's a Muslim. It's easier when it's a black person. It's easy in those cases, but we do need to take it seriously. Again, there are white supremacist Instagram accounts that like hundreds of thousands of people follow, and these aren't trolls. These aren't like random people. These are people who like you went to college with. These are people that you went to school with and that you sit in rooms with, you know?
Just to move on towards representation now, Denise, recently in Fortune's Most Powerful Women list for 2017, I think it was a list of 50 women, but there was only one black woman. And as one of the most powerful African-American women in Silicon Valley, I wanted to know, with our focus on gender and racial inequality, do we tend to just focus on black men when we talk about racial progress and white women when we talk about gender politics, and then women of color just falling through the cracks?
I think there are multiple responses to that. I think the first answer is yes. The second answer to that is there is a disproportionately small number of black women, of African American women in the corporate structures. So are we falling through the cracks, or are we just not seen? I think that there are probably more of us than one might think. I was at a conference maybe 6-7 months ago, sponsored by a magazine in the United States called Black Enterprise. There were 1,200, and they have these conferences frequently, twice a year. There were 1,200 African American and black women in this room who were a part of the corporate structure. celebrated, celebrating one another, but in really effective roles and positions. And I looked around the room, and there were many that I could name: Ursula Burns, Ann Fudge, Rosalind Brewer. These are names of people who, if you turn or you pull up a survey, their names are prominently going to be talked about. My name was not talked about prior to maybe 5 years ago. So of course there's this ascension to this place where people pay attention. There are thousands and thousands of stories, and the stories are not told. I was in a conversation last week with a journalist, like yourself, and she was starting to prod just a bit on the typical story of Silicon Valley and tech and the numbers. She says the numbers aren't improving, the numbers look the same. And I said, you're right, they do in many instances, and here's some instances where they don't. However, let's take a different tack. You're pointing to us and saying, Silicon Valley, what are you doing? And we absolutely have a responsibility because we have some of the best minds and we have some of the best technology. And I believe that we have a responsibility and there's some work that we can do that can change this narrative. But I also believe that everybody has a role in telling the story and changing the narrative. So I kind of turned that around to the journalists and said, what are you doing to help us? What are you doing to change this and make this story not about the numbers, but about the people, about the stories, about those who haven't reached a level of prominence, but are behind the scenes doing the hard work every single day. There are more of us than people might think.
Michael, what do you say to that?
Well, Denise is picking up such a vital issue, and you're a journalist. I used to be a journalist, and the media world finds good news stories very difficult to deal with because it sort of goes against the grain of there must be a cynical undercurrent of something problematic here. And what Denise is saying is, listen, it's not just her or the few hundred. There are thousands of capable people, but unless they receive prominence, profile, and opportunity, they're not going to change the conversation. Now, I was having a conversation in London just 3 weeks ago with someone who works for a major recruiting firm. And this is one of the biggest ones in the UK. And they recruit chief executives and chairmen or chairwomen of organizations, and they recruit people to senior positions. And she's a friend, she's a wonderful young white woman, and she said to me, on no occasion are we ever asked to put forward anybody of color for these positions. We're asked to put forward women. We're asked sometimes to identify people with disabilities. We're never asked to identify anybody of color. And I can imagine that if that is an issue for us in the UK, it's a reality in the US. There's a kind of shield which sort of assumes that actually if you are black in America or you're black in Europe, you're actually not yet on the competency train. You can't fulfill those functions and roles. You haven't got the experience, the expertise, maybe the background. You don't fit the cultural norms. Your voice isn't relevant. Maybe you're threatening. And so one of the things that she's decided to do, and I'm trying to help her with this, is to build conversations between senior executives in major corporations and young black women and men who have the potential for executive leadership, for position, for governance, for chairmanship, for chairwomanship, for chief executive, to build that conversations, which allows exactly the point we were making earlier, that once people meet each other and they realize, actually, you're not that threatening, and that prejudice I held about you doesn't hold true. If we can break those barriers of assumption, I think part of it, DeRay is far better, and Denise far better at this than I am, but one of the things that frustrates me about this whole conversation on racial politics is we've had 8 years of America's first black president. And you'd kind of think after 8 years of America's first black president, we would not be having a Charlottesville conversation. We'd assume that we would not be revisiting conversations that went on in the 1960s. But we are. And why is that? And it's partly, sadly, and I'm conscious of many of my South African friends who are here, we had the wonderful period of the Mandela presidency. And then we've had two intriguingly, awkwardly different presidencies ever since. And that's the politest way to put it. And you kind of wonder what happens when the best of the best is not embedded into the thinking of a political system so that the system changes. The person moves on, but the entrenched old-fashioned nature of the system remains stuck. And we're only ever going to change this if the language around who we are as black women and men, about our capabilities, about our skills, about our competencies, about our commitment, about our own sense of passion for nation, about our longing for justice in every corner of the world, unless that is given voice and articulation. So we need, and again, I'd love to hear DeRay's reflection on this, is we need to move from being protesters into being process participants. As a legislator, I understand that there are things I may wish to do in Parliament in the UK, but there is a process built up over generations, centuries, that I have to learn to work within to get to be able to affect a change. But if I don't join the back of the train, I'm never going to get to the front.
Yeah.
So I have to join the worm to find my way to the place where the little voice can bite off the head.
I'm kind of... I wanted to touch on something that you said, Denise, that it's not only just about numbers in Silicon Valley, but you've taken on a new role in Apple for inclusion and diversity, and a lot of that is going to be about the numbers, and I just kind of wanted to know whether black women is a priority for you in this new role.
I'll say this. So first of all, it's a new role, but it's not. I've been black and a woman for a long time, and I've been playing this role. I have been doing this work. I have been playing this role for a very long time. I have been a first. I've been an only. When I was the same conference that I just referenced, there were numbers and numbers of black women together, successful, professional, astonishing black women, and we were sharing stories, and every single one of us could share the same stories about being in a room, in a meeting, and someone assumed that you were the assistant, the secretary, that you were not the manager, you were not the boss, and that your person, that your staff person that was 3 levels below you was your boss. We all shared those stories. So, and another thing that I think is really, really important is this concept of role models, right? And I've had many of my colleagues say, it's so great that you're a role model for so many people, and you're so inspirational, and that's good, and I appreciate that, I accept that, I receive that, but it is so much more than that. When we as human beings can visualize someone who has made it through barriers, who has gotten to, who has achieved, who has persevered, when you are so frustrated, when you can share the same stories, when you can see someone who has done that, you say, I can do that. So the power that's in that is greater and much more expansive than simply being, that's really nice and wonderful and inspirational.
Yes.
There's a greater power behind role modeling. I almost wish we could come up with a new label for it, because it's kind of almost diminished in some way. There's an incredible amount of power building, empowering that happens when one can see a vision of themselves ahead of their circumstances.
And we know that whose story gets told is a very political thing, and that's not just an issue within the business world. I kind of wanted to come back to you, DeRay, about Black Lives Matter, a movement that was founded by 3 black queer women, but we don't tend to see many black women come to the forefront of these of the movement. And what I mean by that is, the hashtags that we use, the cases of police brutality that we highlight tend to be black men, and the people who are doing the work behind this are black women. Is this an issue that you've noticed, and is it something that you're taking on as the movement grows?
Yeah, we think about the movement is started by the protesters in Ferguson, but the hashtag did originate with 3 Black women. And what is important to remember is that this often is a question of who is asking the question. So when we think about the police, it's like the police in America kill about 1,000 people a year, and the overwhelming number of people they kill is men. So if you focus on like police violence that results in death, it'll just heavily be male just because that's who they're killing. But if you focus on police violence that is about sexual assault, that's about harassment, right? It is heavily women. And how do we start asking a different question about this work? And I think that that is what we need to get to, that we don't do often. That when we talk about erasure, the issues of erasure often manifest in 2 ways. One is that either the story is never told or is told by everybody but us. And what was really powerful about Twitter is that it allowed all of us to be storytellers. So you saw queer people, you saw women. I'm a gay Black man, and I never would have had this platform if there was like a committee that got to choose people, right? Like, and that was really powerful for so many of us. Now, when I think about this issue of the gender disparity or just identity in general, I'm also reminded that we have to be vigilant about using our platforms to highlight other people's stories, that it's beautiful that we have platforms, but we have to like make sure that we tell the stories of other people too, because that's so much a part of our work when we think about what comes ahead. So I'm hopeful. I think that we've been talking about like the trans community and identity and women and queer people in a way that we've never done in the country before, and it can only get better.
That's brilliant.
Amina, you also asked me about my work at Apple, particularly who do I focus on? I focus on everyone. Diversity is the human experience. I get a little bit frustrated when diversity or the term diversity is tagged to the people of color or the women or the LGBT or whatever, because that means they're carrying that around. Thank you. Because that means that we are carrying that around on our foreheads. And I've often told people a story of there can be 12 white, blue-eyed, blonde men in a room, and they are going to be diverse too, because they're going to bring a different life experience and life perspective to the conversation. The issue is representation and mix, and bringing all the voices into the room that can contribute to the outcome of any situation. So I focus on everyone, but I also focus on allies and alliances, because to DeRay's point, there's an incredible amount of power in those who have platforms or those who have the benefit of greater representation to tell the stories of those who do not. And so whenever we can accomplish that, then that is a win for everyone. And I think that's something that people, that we all tend to, or particularly those who protest about things that they're fearful about, we can all win in this story. And so that's what I try to focus on in Apple.
And I'll just add that this issue of access is one that is really important when we think about this work of diversity and inclusion, about recruiting, about what it means to have a seat at the table. And I'm reminded that there's so many white people who don't realize that white people say to me all the time, like, DeRay, I worked really hard for this. Like, I worked hard. And it's like, well, you didn't work hard for every Band-Aid to look like you, for every baby doll to look like you. For like the world to treat you as human and everything as other is not the result of like your personal hard work. That's what white privilege is, and that's what white supremacy looks like. And how do we start to be honest about that? Because the reason some of these rooms look a certain way is because there's like a network of people that have been, like a world has been built around them, and then there's a set of people who have been excluded from that. And how do we start to be honest about that? So we think about things like affirmative action. We think about in America, Black people weren't allowed to read. So I'm a third generation reader. I'm in the third generation of my family who can read and comprehend text. That is wild. So to not account for that means that you are just missing a part of the equation. That there's not enough invitations that can make up for the skill sets that were intentionally denied from people of color for centuries. And then we have to start talking about that.
I wanted to now bring the conversation over to Brexit.
It's like you're Donald Trump. Brexit.
You're just jealous.
It's okay, everything's terrible.
It's very good here in Colombia.
Right.
I wanted to know, do you think Brexit is a huge step backwards for racial progress in the UK? And I guess the way we see that the far right is growing in Europe, is racial progress really slowly eroding?
Well, look, here's some of the difficult reality about Brexit. A load of, and I know this because I've met them, a load of black Brits voted out of Europe. So it's not about racial politics, although it is partly about fear and hate politics. In fact, the people that are being objected to by the hard Brexiteers, as in the migrant numbers that they're worrying about, these are white East Europeans. So in that sense, it's a different kind of conversation. It's about people who bring their culture with them and then take over communities, and as they take over communities, so they feel like the white traditionalists are pushed out. It's a setback because it's all about embedded fears and frustrations. But you know, what worries me is beyond Brexit. I mean, you know, this thing is falling off, so don't worry, I haven't got an ear problem. I might have that. What worries me more about Brexit is that you look at what happened in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders, came very close. You look at what happened in Austria recently with the Austrian presidential elections, very close. What I referenced earlier in my introduction about the RDF in Germany, you know, this is a serious entity for first time in 60 years. What we've seen with the French far right, what we're seeing essentially with the British far right, there's the re-emergence of a kind of aggressive fear politics, not necessarily hate politics, fear politics. And with that comes the temptation to articulate again all the things that we said that we thought were once yesterday's conversation. So Brexit may or may not happen. I venture to suggest it is an open question. And, you know, the people have voted, but the people can vote again. I venture to suggest that. And here is going to be the challenge. Whether we, as the UK, are in or out of Europe, are we open to people of what is basically an island made up of many nations, many cultures, many voices, and many cultures and colours? Are we open to continue that progress? Or do we want to go back to once when there were just Nordic people with red hair and wonderful eyes, and that was once the view of what was then old England? That's not England now. It's not Wales now. It's not Scotland now. It's not even Ireland now. So Europe has changed beyond recognition. Europe is a place that embraces diversity and difference. We've been one of the best receivers, particularly the Germans and the Swedes and the Norwegian people, and the Danes have been the best receivers of migrants coming out of the Middle East. It's been a wonderful adventure of change in those countries. Are we going to go backwards to the conversations of the 50s and 60s? I plead not. So let's understand that Brexit is really more an economic issue, and it's a sovereignty issue. It's not really a race issue, but race has got caught up in it because people fear that someone else is pushing for their role and their place. Now, this inclusive conversation that we all say we want, we who are, there are 4 of us on this platform who are black. We have to be as inclusive in our conversation and our embrace as we expect everybody else to be. And that lies a challenge on our doorstep. Thank you.